It was a quiet afternoon in a small suburban neighborhood when a routine traffic stop turned into something far from ordinary. A white police officer, fresh-faced and confident in his authority, pulled over a black man driving an unassuming sedan. The reason? A minor traffic violation, or so it seemed. As the officer approached the car, his tone was firm but polite. The driver, calm and composed, handed over his license and registration without hesitation. Yet, there was something in the man's demeanor, a quiet confidence, an air of authority, that the officer couldn't quite place. Still, procedures had to be followed, and the officer decided to search the car. What happened next was a moment that neither of them would ever forget. As the officer began his search, he stumbled upon something that stopped him in his tracks, a badge. Not just any badge, but one that revealed the driver's true identity, a retired FBI agent. The air grew heavy with unspoken tension. The officer froze, realizing the implications of his actions. The man's calm expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. What would happen next? Would this encounter turn into a moment of understanding, or escalate into something else entirely? Stay tuned as we unravel the rest of this gripping story, where assumptions are challenged and a routine stop becomes anything but. The officer stood there, badge in hand, trying to process what he had just discovered. The emblem gleamed in the sunlight, its letters spelling out what he hadn't expected: Federal Bureau of Investigation. He looked up at the man in the driver's seat, his calm gaze unwavering, as if waiting for the officer to make his next move. The silence between them was thick, but the officer knew he couldn't let his hesitation show. He cleared his throat and asked, "You're retired FBI?" The man nodded, his voice steady but measured. "That's right, 30 years of service." He leaned back in his seat, watching the officer with a quiet intensity. "Is there a problem, officer?" The question lingered in the air. The officer couldn't help but wonder how a man with such a background had ended up in this situation. He started replaying everything in his mind. Was there something he missed? Was the stop even necessary? Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this man's calmness came from a lifetime of experiences he couldn't begin to understand. The officer tried to regain control of the moment. "Just following procedure," he said, but even to his own ears, it sounded hollow. His grip on the badge tightened as he considered what to do next, unsure of how this encounter would end. The officer took a step back, his mind racing. He had been trained to follow protocol, but this situation felt different. His eyes shifted between the badge and the man sitting in the car, whose calm demeanor was almost unnerving. The man wasn't defensive, wasn't raising his voice, and yet there was an undeniable weight in his presence. "What did you do in the FBI?" the officer asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. The man smiled faintly, a trace of amusement flickering across his face. "A little bit of everything. Organized crime, counterterrorism, even some undercover work, you name it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But that was a long time ago. Now I'm just enjoying retirement." The officer nodded slowly, though his nerves were still on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a routine stop anymore. The man's history added layers to the encounter, layers the officer wasn't sure how to navigate. He thought about the stories he'd heard about racial profiling, about power dynamics, about how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. As he continued the search, he noticed the man watching him closely, not with hostility, but with a kind of knowing look, as if he could predict every move the officer was about to make. It was unsettling, and the tension between them grew thicker with each passing second. The officer's hands moved methodically as he continued the search, but his mind was anything but calm. Every detail of this encounter seemed magnified: the retired FBI agent's composed posture, the faint hum of passing traffic, the distant chatter on his police radio. It all felt like a ticking clock, counting down to an unknown conclusion. Inside the car, everything appeared in order. No weapons, no suspicious items, nothing to justify extending the stop. But the officer hesitated, his instincts telling him there was more to this man than met the eye. He couldn't decide if it was the man's calmness that unnerved him or his own growing doubt about how this would look. A white officer pulling over a black man, only to discover he was someone who had likely spent decades enforcing the same laws. The man leaned slightly forward, his voice steady but firm. "You know, I've been in your shoes before. A young officer, trying to do the right thing. But sometimes, the right thing isn't about following the script. It's about using your judgment." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the officer felt a pang of defensiveness. He straightened up, gripping his belt, but before he could respond, the man added, "Whatever you're looking for, I hope you're prepared for what you might find." The officer froze, his heart pounding. What did that mean? Was it a warning? A test? His breath quickened as he realized this encounter was far from over, and he might not be the one in control. The officer's pulse quickened as the retired FBI agent's words echoed in his mind. Was the man hinting at something he hadn't yet uncovered? His gaze darted back to the car, scanning for anything he might have overlooked. The man remained seated, calm and composed, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, as if he knew the officer was second-guessing himself. Suddenly, the officer's radio crackled to life, breaking the tense silence. A dispatch call came through about a nearby incident. A car matching this vehicle's description had been reported leaving the scene of a suspicious activity. The officer stiffened, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. His eyes narrowed as he glanced back at the man, whose expression remained unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said firmly, his voice carrying an edge of authority. The man hesitated for the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance, concern, crossing his face. "Is this really necessary?" the man asked, his tone calm but pointed. "Just following procedure," the officer replied, though the words felt more like a shield than an explanation. As the man stepped out of the car, the officer noticed something unexpected, a small file folder tucked beneath the driver's seat. "What's that?" the officer asked, his voice sharp. The man paused, his eyes locking with the officer's. "You might want to be careful with that," he said quietly. "Not everything is as it seems." The officer's stomach tightened as he reached for the folder, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. What was in it? And why did the man's words feel less like a warning and more like a challenge? The stakes had just been raised, and the officer realized he was in deeper than he ever expected. The officer crouched down and carefully retrieved the folder, his fingers brushing against its worn edges. It was thicker than he'd expected, packed with documents that seemed oddly organized for something left under a car seat. As he flipped it open, his eyes widened. Inside were detailed reports, surveillance photos, and official FBI seals stamped across multiple pages. It didn't take long to realize what he was holding, an ongoing case file. "What is this?" the officer demanded, standing up quickly. His voice was sharp now, the tension finally breaking through his professional exterior. The man leaned casually against his car, his calm demeanor unshaken. "That's classified," he said, his tone almost amused. "And it shouldn't be in your hands." The officer's mind raced. Why was this retired FBI agent carrying an active case file? And more importantly, what was he doing here in this quiet suburb? He glanced at the photos again, realizing they showed people who looked dangerous, figures connected to organized crime. The man in front of him was clearly no ordinary retiree. "You're still working, aren't you?" the officer asked, his voice a mix of accusation and disbelief. The man's faint smile returned. Sometimes, retirement isn't as relaxing as it's made out to be. Before the officer could respond, a black SUV pulled up nearby, its windows tinted dark. The man straightened, his calm demeanor shifting to something more serious. "That's my ride," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer stood frozen as two men in suits stepped out of the SUV, their movements efficient and purposeful. They nodded at the man, ignoring the officer entirely. "Thanks for keeping an eye on things," the man said, climbing into the vehicle. "But next time, trust your instincts a little more." And just like that, they were gone, leaving the officer standing alone with the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. He looked at the now empty street, realizing he had been part of something far bigger than a routine stop, a world he was never meant to understand. The officer stood there, the sound of the SUV fading into the distance, leaving only the hum of the quiet street behind. He exhaled deeply, realizing he had been holding his breath. The weight of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a brush with a world he'd only seen in movies, a world of high-stakes operations, hidden agendas, and people playing by rules far above his pay grade.